A dog adopted 3 orphaned lion cubs, and a few years later, something terrible happened. Do you know what a disaster that hasn't happened yet smells like? It smells like ozone before a thunderstorm, wet dust on hot ground, and a faint hint of a wild animal where it shouldn't be. That was exactly the air that hung over the Medveji Ugol farmstead on that July evening. The storm descended on the Kameni Poyas Nature Reserve suddenly, with the fury of a deceived predator. The sky cracked, and streams of water poured down on the earth, turning forest roads into muddy, impassable rivers. Ivan Petrovich Sokolov, the owner of the only inhabited house within 10 kilometers, was awake. He sat on his old porch, listening to the roar of the elements. His dog, a 10-year-old German shepherd named Kaiser, lay at his feet. The old dog was alarmed. He was not afraid of thunder. He heard something else, something that did not belong in this forest. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. Suddenly, through the sound of the rain, there was the screech of brakes and a dull, heavy thud. The sound came from the old track, an abandoned road now used only by loggers and those who didn't want to encounter the patrols. Ivan stood up. He knew this road and those who traveled it. Poachers, smugglers. He took a heavy lantern from the shelf and his trusty double-barreled shotgun. "Let's go, Kaiser. See what devils this night has brought us," he said quietly. Kaiser was already standing at the door, his ears pricked up and the hair on his neck standing on end. They stepped out into the wall of rain. After half an hour of walking along the muddy trail, they saw it. An old, battered truck lay in a ditch, its side embedded in a mighty pine tree. The doors were wide open, but there was no one inside. Fresh footprints led deeper into the forest, away from the road. But Kaiser didn't pull Ivan toward the footprints. He pulled him toward the back of the truck, toward the mangled metal body. Ivan shone his flashlight inside. Lying on the wet hay was a huge body, a lioness. Her glass eyes stared into nothingness, and next to her, nothing. The body was empty. "She's dead. They got away, the bastards," Ivan muttered, looking around. But Kaiser suddenly whimpered and lunged to the side, under the twisted roots of a fallen tree. He began to bark softly, not menacingly, but invitingly. Ivan approached, directed the beam of his flashlight into the dark niche under the roots, and froze. There, huddled together in a trembling, squeaking heap, sat 3 creatures. 3 tiny lion cubs, each no bigger than a domestic kitten. Their eyes, still clouded with a blue baby haze, blinked fearfully in the light of the lantern. Their mother had died in an accident, and these little ones were left alone in the middle of a strange, hostile forest. Ivan was a gamekeeper. He knew the laws of nature. Without their mother, they wouldn't survive the night. They would be eaten by foxes, or they would simply die of hunger and cold. He sighed heavily. The right thing to do was to just walk away. Let nature take its course. But then Kaiser did something incredible. He cautiously approached the bundle, lay down next to it, and began to lick them, gently like a mother. Feeling the warmth and protection, the lion cubs immediately snuggled up to his thick fur and fell silent. Ivan watched the scene, and something in his heart, hardened by loneliness, stirred. He took off his old canvas jacket, carefully wrapped the whole squeaking bundle in it along with the dog, and hoisting the heavy load onto his shoulders, trudged home. He did not yet know that on that night, he had not just saved 3 doomed animals, He had brought future tragedy into his home. The first few weeks were hell. Even diluted goat's milk, which he bought from a neighbor on a distant farm, and fed the lion cubs from a baby bottle every 3 hours. He slept fitfully, constantly listening for their squeaks. But it was Kaiser who became their real mother. He never left their side. He warmed them, licked them, taught them to walk, and gently punished them for their sharp claws. The lion cubs accepted him unconditionally. They slept buried in his fur, followed him everywhere, and copied his movements. For them, the old dog was a leader, protector, and mother all rolled into one. Ivan watched them and gave them names. He named the largest and most insolent one, Raikom. The graceful and most intelligent one was named Zara. And the smallest and most cunning one, who was always trying to snatch the best piece, he nicknamed Shram, Scar, after he scratched his stronger brother's eyebrow during a game. Months passed. The house was filled with life. For the first time in many years after his wife's death, Ivan no longer felt lonely. He talked to his unusual pets, repaired their toys, and built wooden slides for them in the yard. He was happy, and that happiness blinded him. 2 years passed. The hot summer of 2025 was an exact copy of the one 2 years earlier. But now it wasn't funny kittens running around Ivan's yard, but 3 young cats, full of predatory power. Ryuk now weighed nearly 150 kilograms, and his roar shook the windows of the house. Zara moved with the silent grace of a professional assassin. Shram learned how to open any latch and squeeze through the narrowest of gaps. Their games with Kaiser became increasingly rough. The old dog, wise and patient, endured everything. But Ivan increasingly noticed how, after another game, Kaiser would retreat to his corner and lick his bruises and scratches for a long time. Even built a spacious enclosure for them out of thick steel mesh, but he knew it was only a temporary measure. He looked into their yellow, wild eyes and saw not his children, but ruthless predators created for the African savanna, not the backyard of a Ural farmstead. The first alarm bell rang in early July. The chickens belonging to Ivan's neighbor, the same one from whom he bought milk, had a habit of straying onto his property. Usually the lions paid no attention to them. But on that day, something changed. Ivan was in the house when he heard frantic clucking and a low, guttural growl. He rushed out onto the porch. Ryuk stood over the torn carcass of a chicken, his muzzle covered in blood. Zara and Scar stood nearby, watching intently. Kaiser barked, trying to chase them away, but Ryuk only growled, flattening his ears. For the first time, Ivan saw in his eyes not playfulness, but the cold fury of an owner defending his prey. It took Ivan a tremendous effort to drive the trio back into the enclosure. In the evening, the neighbor came over. He didn't shout. He just looked silently at Ivan, then at the enclosure, and said, "Petrovich, this won't end well. These are wild animals. You know that better than I do." Ivan gave him the money for the chicken, but a heavy feeling remained. His neighbor was right. A week later, a man in uniform appeared at his doorstep. He was young, about 30 years old, with a confident look and a folder in his hands. "Nature Conservation Inspector, Viktor Sergeyevich Orlov," he introduced himself. "Ivan Petrovich Sokolov? We've received a report. They say you're keeping wild animals. 3 African lions. Is that true?" Ivan had nothing to hide. He nodded silently toward the enclosure. The inspector approached, looked at the lions for a long time, then returned. His face was serious and inscrutable. "Ivan Petrovich, you are a former gamekeeper. You are well aware of Article 245 of the Criminal Code and the federal law on the responsible treatment of animals. Keeping such predators in private conditions is strictly prohibited. Orlov opened a folder and took out an official form. This is an order. You have 30 days to voluntarily hand over the animals to the State Transit Center. Otherwise, we will be forced to seize them. And then it will be a completely different conversation. Ivan froze. A state shelter. He knew what that meant. Cramped concrete cages, meager food, and a slow death from loneliness and disease. For his lions, who had grown up in freedom, it was a death sentence. They were born here, almost. They're tame. They won't survive there, he said desperately. Inspector Orlov merely shrugged. The law is the law, Ivan Petrovich. You have 30 days. The clock is ticking. He got into his official Niva and drove away, leaving Ivan alone with an official document in his hands that smelled of trouble. Ivan looked at the enclosure. The lions, sensing his anxiety, paced back and forth. Kaiser approached and nudged his wet nose against Ivan's hand. At that moment, Rick, the most powerful and impatient of the lions, approached the fence and let out a low, guttural roar. He wasn't looking at Ivan. He was looking at Kaiser. And there was no more filial love in that gaze. There was the cold, appraising curiosity of a predator sizing up the strength of an old leader. 30 days. The phrase echoed in Ivan's mind like a pendulum above the head of a condemned man. Slowly, with a kind of detached precision, he folded the order in 4 and put it in his pocket. The paper chilled his thigh, even through the thick fabric of his pants. He looked at Kaiser. The old dog understood everything. He didn't whine or bark, just walked over and laid his heavy gray head on Ivan's knee. It was a gesture of support, a silent agreement to stand together until the end. Ivan didn't sleep all night. He sat at the table, going over old contacts in his head. In 40 years of working at the reserve, he knew many people. He started making calls. The first call was to his old friend Semyonich, now a big boss in the regional hunting department. Semyonich coughed into the phone for a long time, sympathized, but threw up his hands. Petrovich, you understand the system. There's a paper, but no person. I can't go against orders. It's a matter for the courts. The second call was to a well-known private safari park 1,000 kilometers away. They were interested, but the process of transportation and paperwork. We won't be able to do it in less than 6 months, the manager replied politely. 6 months. He didn't even have a month. Hope faded with each passing day. Time slipped away like sand through his fingers. Even aged 10 years. He almost stopped sleeping and ate only enough to keep himself going. All his attention was focused on the enclosure. The lions sensed his despair. They became nervous and irritable. Roar paced along the fence for hours, his muscles rippling beneath his shiny coat. He growled at Kaiser more and more often for no reason, asserting his right to the territory. Zara, the most sensitive of the lions, almost stopped eating. She lay in the far corner, her eyes frozen with anxiety. And Scar. Scar became quiet and inconspicuous. But Ivan saw how he watched for hours. Not him, not his brothers. He studied the enclosure, every post, every loop, every lock. He was looking for a weak spot. And this quiet, focused activity frightened Ivan more than Rika's open aggression. On the 10th day, when almost all hope was gone, Ivan made a decision. It was desperate, insane, but it was the only thing he was capable of. If the system couldn't save them, he would hide them from the system. 5 kilometers from home, in a remote ravine on the very edge of the reserve, he began to build a new enclosure. a secret one. He got up before dawn, hoisted heavy rolls of steel mesh, bags of cement, and tools onto his shoulders, and went into the forest. He worked like a man possessed, feeling no pain in his aching back and sore hands. He dug holes for the posts, mixed concrete, and stretched the mesh. The water from his flask tasted of rust. Sweat poured into his eyes, but he kept working. Kaiser was always nearby. He lay in the shade, guarding his master, and sometimes whimpered quietly, seeing how hard the work was for Ivan. He even talked to him as if he were a person. "It's okay, friend. We'll manage. This is our last chance. We won't give them up." He was in a hurry. He knew that Inspector Orlov could arrive for an inspection at any moment. During the day, Ivan pretended to be resigned. He repaired the fence, chopped wood, and created the appearance of a normal life. But at night, by moonlight, he would go to his secret construction site. The enclosure was growing. It was bigger and more secure than the old one, dug firmly into the ground with a double mesh ceiling. It was a fortress, his fortress against the whole world. There was only 1 week left until the end of his sentence. Ivan was working at the limit of human endurance. He had lost weight, become gaunt, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. But most of the work was done. All that remained was to reinforce the gate and finish the top mesh. 2 or 3 more days. He was almost there. And then the second disaster struck. The neighbor, the one whose chicken Ryuk had killed, lost his goat. He was walking through the forest, calling for it, and accidentally stumbled upon the ravine. He saw Ivan and saw the almost finished enclosure. The neighbor understood everything. His face froze. He didn't scream. He just turned around and headed back toward the village. Ivan rushed after him. "Wait, Mikhalich, don't do it. I'll pay for the goat. I'll pay for 10 of them." The neighbor stopped and looked at him with cold, angry eyes. "It's not about the goat, Petrovich. I warned you, these are wild animals. You're putting us all in danger. Today it's a goat, and tomorrow what? A child will wander into the forest? I'll call the authorities. Today." And he left without looking back. The ground fell away from under Ivan's feet. It was all over. Now Orlov wouldn't be coming in a week. He'd be here tomorrow, or even tonight. And the enclosure wasn't ready. Ivan ran home without looking where he was going. His head was a fog. What to do? Try to move the lions to the unfinished enclosure at night? That's crazy. They'll tear him to pieces. Leave everything as it is and wait for the inspector to arrive? That means sending them to their deaths. He rushed into the yard, his heart pounding in his throat. The lions in the old enclosure were agitated. They could sense his panic. They roared against the fence, bellowing with rage. Scar backed into a corner and bared his teeth. Only Zara looked at Ivan with a kind of human longing. Then, drowning out the lion's roars, he heard the sound of a car approaching. A familiar official Neva turned onto the road. Inspector Orlov got out. He was not alone. With him were 2 burly men in veterinary service uniforms, carrying large canvas bags. In one of them, Ivan saw the butt of a rifle with a tranquilizer. Orlov approached the gate. His face was stern. "Sokolov, I got a call. I have been informed that not only do you have no intention of complying with the order, but you are also carrying out illegal construction on the territory of the reserve." He nodded toward the forest. "I gave you 30 days. They expire tomorrow. But given the new circumstances, we will not wait any longer. We are here to seize the animals. Right now." Ivan stood in front of the enclosure, spreading his arms as if trying to cover it with his body. Behind him, 300 kilograms of fury and primal power were rushing about. Kaiser stood nearby, pressed against his leg. He didn't growl. He just stared at the strangers, and there was steel in his gaze. "I won't give them up," Ivan said quietly but firmly. The inspector sighed and signaled to his assistants. "Don't make this difficult, Petrovich. Step aside. We don't want to use force." At that moment, Scar, who had been quietly pawing at the weakened fastening at the ground with his paw, jerked it sharply. The old wire snapped. He slipped through the gap that had formed. Behind him, Ryuk leaped out in a single bound. Freedom hit him like a blow to the head. He let out a deafening roar, and this roar was not one of rage. It was a roar of victory. The world froze for a moment. Inspector Orlov and his assistants were petrified, their professional confidence evaporating, giving way to primal fear. It was one thing to remove an animal from a cage, but quite another to stand face to face with a free, enraged predator. Zara, seeing that her brothers were free, did not hesitate either. She easily jumped over the torn net and stood next to Rika, her body tense as a stretched string. 3 young lions, masters of the situation, stood opposite 3 confused people. Scar, the initiator of the escape, immediately took a couple of steps back, behind Rico. His job was done. Now it was up to the leader to deal with them. Ivan, paralyzed with fear, could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Back! Back to the enclosure!" But his voice was drowned out by Rika's low, vibrating growl. The lion took a step forward, and at that most tense moment, when the air seemed thick enough to cut, a new participant in the drama appeared. The neighbor's dog, a mongrel named Pirate, attracted by the noise, jumped out from around the corner of the house. She saw strangers, unfamiliar animals, and her owner, who was running toward Ivan's house after hearing the roar. Pirate, doing her doggy duty, let out a loud, shrill bark. For Rika, whose brain was overloaded with adrenaline, this was the last straw. He perceived the little dog's barking as insolent, unthinkable aggression against him, Rika on his territory. He crouched down, his tail twitching. All his instincts, all the genetic memory of thousands of generations of predators screamed one word at him: attack. Inspector Orlov, finally coming out of his stupor, shouted to his assistant, "Gun, quick!" But Kaiser was faster. He didn't think. He acted. All his life he had been a service dog, a shepherd, a protector. His job was to maintain order, protect the pack, prevent conflict. With one leap, he was between the lions and the barking dog. He did not attack. He stood sideways, as dogs do to show they are not aggressive, but blocking the path. He barked briefly and authoritatively. It was not a threatening bark. It was the leader's command. "Stop, calm down." He was trying to do what he had done hundreds of times before, when the lion cubs were small and played games that were too dangerous. He tried to separate them, calm them down, bring them back to their familiar world, where lion, dog, and man were one family. Ivan saw this, and for a second, hope flashed in his heart. Kaiser would handle it. He always did. But he was looking at the situation through human eyes, and Reich looked at it through the eyes of a beast. In his world, at that very moment, the old sick dog who had always been an authority figure suddenly stood in his way. He stood in the way of his prey, of his assertion of power over his territory. He did not perceive this as an attempt at reconciliation. He perceived it as a challenge, a direct, brazen challenge to his status as alpha. Years of living together, thousands of hours of play, a shared bowl, lying warm side by the fireplace. All of it burned in an instant, in the fire of primal instinct. Rika's eyes changed. The yellow fire in them was replaced by an icy, focused flame. He no longer saw Kaiser, his adoptive father. He saw a rival. Rika let out a short, strangled growl and lunged toward Kaiser. It wasn't a blow yet, but a test. Kaiser didn't back down. He responded with a hollow growl, baring his fangs. He was still trying to reason with his puppy. "I'm the leader. I decide what to do," his whole body said. Seeing this, Zara whimpered and took a step back. She was torn between loyalty to her old protector and the instinct to follow the new, strong leader. Even shouted, his voice breaking, "Rick, no, Kaiser, come to me." He rushed forward, but the distance was too great. The assistant inspector was already raising his tranquilizer gun, but he was afraid to shoot. The animals were too close to each other. He could have hit the wrong one. It all happened in a split second. Rick, realizing that the old leader would not back down, moved from threat to action. He jumped. It was not a playful leap like the ones they had fought with on the lawn. It was an explosion of pure power and fury. 150 kilograms of muscle crashed down on the old sheepdog. Kaiser was an experienced fighter. He managed to dodge the first blow aimed at his throat and grabbed Rick by the scruff of the neck. For a moment, they were entangled in a roaring, snarling ball of gray and sandy fur. Ivan saw fangs flashing, heard cracking and crunching. He ran, stumbling, his lungs burning, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. He saw Ryuk use his weight and strength to pin Kaiser to the ground. The old dog fought desperately, but the odds were against him. Rick released his jaws for a moment, shook off Kaiser's teeth, and delivered a second decisive blow. His jaws, designed to break antelope bones, closed on the German shepherd's neck. There was a dull, sickening crunch. Even Sokolov's world split into two pieces, before and after. The dull crunch of broken vertebrae sounded louder than a gunshot in the deafening silence. Rick let go of the limp body and took a step back. He was breathing heavily, blood dripping from his mouth. But it wasn't his blood. He looked at the work of his paws without anger, without malice, with a kind of cold, animal bewilderment, as if he himself did not fully understand what had just happened. Instinct pushed him, and he obeyed. The question of dominance had been settled. Now he was the only leader. Kaiser lay on the ground, with his neck twisted unnaturally, his eyes, which a second ago had been full of fire and devotion, now empty and glassy. His paws, which had brought Ivan the stick thousands of times and trampled the forest paths, were now motionless. Blood flowed from his mouth in a thin stream, mixing with the dust. Ivan stopped. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. All sound, all feeling in the world seemed to have been turned off. He looked at his dead friend, and his head was filled with absolute, ringing emptiness. The veterinarian who had been aiming at the lions lowered his rifle. Inspector Orlov took off his cap and ran his hand through his wet hair. Even the neighbor who had come running at the noise froze in place, his mouth open. The little mongrel pirate, with whom it had all begun, tucked her tail between her legs and hid behind her owner. The only sound in the dead silence was Zara's quiet, plaintive whimpering. She approached Kaiser's body, nudged it gently with her nose, then again. Receiving no response, she raised her head and let out a long, anguished howl, more like a cry than a predator's roar. She didn't understand why the new leader had killed the old one. Then the silence was broken by a deafening crash. It was Ivan who fired. He didn't even remember raising his old rifle. He wasn't aiming at anyone. He fired into the sky, into that indifferent, heat-blanched sky. It was a shot of despair, pain, and impotent rage. The shot rang out into the void, but the sharp, deafening sound brought everyone out of their stupor. The lions, frightened by the shot, recoiled. Scar was the first to run away, hiding behind the corner of the house. Ryuk, as if awakening, shook his head and followed him. Zara took one last look at Ivan with eyes full of horror and disappeared after him. Orlov, coming to his senses, gave a short order. "Surround the house. Don't shoot to kill. Get your darts ready." The men in uniform ran about, carrying out the orders. Ivan saw and heard nothing. Slowly, as if in a dream, he approached Kaiser. He knelt down in the dust next to his body. He gently touched his head and ran his hand through the thick fur on his neck, the same fur that had stood on end at the sight of danger. The fur was still warm. He closed his eyes. His entire life with Kaiser flashed before him in a single second. The first day he brought him home, a small, clumsy puppy. Their first hunt. The long winter evenings by the fireplace. The way Kaiser greeted him at the gate after a long absence. How he had dragged those lion cubs to him, saving them from certain death. He had saved them, only for them to kill him 2 years later. The thought was so monstrous and unjust that Ivan's mind refused to accept it. He didn't notice Inspector Orlov approaching him. Orlov put his hand on his shoulder. "Ivan Petrovich, I'm very sorry. We're taking him away." Ivan slowly raised his head. His faded blue eyes were completely dry, but there was so much grief in them that Orlov involuntarily took a step back. "Don't touch him," Ivan said quietly, but in such a way that no one dared to object. "I'll do it myself." Over the next half hour, an operation to capture the animals unfolded. The lions, which had hidden in the barn, were blocked. Through a crack in the wall, the veterinarian fired a tranquilizer dart. First at Rika, then at Zara, then at Shrama. 10 minutes later, it was all over. The sleeping predators, now defenseless again, just as they had been on the night Ivan found them, were carried out and loaded into a special van with cages. Ivan did not watch any of this. He sat on the ground next to his dog. When the van drove away and silence reigned in the yard again, he carefully lifted Kaiser into his arms as if he were the most precious jewel. The body was heavy and limp. He carried it to the garden, behind the house, to the old apple tree where Kaiser loved to lie on hot days. He brought a shovel and began to dig. He dug for a long time, methodically, putting all his pain and bitterness into every stroke of the shovel. The neighbor and Orlov stood at a distance, not daring to approach. When the grave was ready, he carefully lowered his friend's body into it, wrapped in his old canvas jacket. He did not put up a cross or a stone. He simply covered the grave with earth. When it was all over, he stuck the shovel into the ground and stood there, staring at the fresh mound. A huge black hole had formed in his house, in his life, in his soul. A hole the size of a German shepherd. Several months passed. A cold, rainy autumn arrived. Ivan lived like a robot. He got up, fed the chickens, stoked the stove, and went to bed. The silence in the house weighed heavily on him. It was physically palpable. Sometimes he thought he heard the familiar sound of claws on the floor or quiet sniffling near his bed. He turned around and saw only emptiness. He stopped visiting Kaiser's grave. It was too painful. He blamed himself, not the lions. They were just animals, obeying their instincts. He blamed himself for his pride, for thinking he could cheat nature. He thought that love and care could change the nature of a predator. He was cruelly mistaken, and the one he loved most in the world paid for that mistake. One day, the postman brought him a letter. The envelope was official, with the logo of a large private safari park in another region. The very same one he had called in desperation. Start playback. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The letter was printed on high-quality paper with an official logo. Ivan read slowly, analyzing every word. It was written by the director of the safari park. He reported that Inspector Orlov, deeply shocked by the tragedy at the farm, had taken the case under his personal control. He had used his connections, prepared a report describing the uniqueness of the situation, and achieved the impossible. The lions were not sent to a state transit center. As an exception, they were transferred directly to this safari park as animals requiring special supervision due to their unusual upbringing. The director wrote that the animals were physically healthy. They had undergone quarantine. They were released into a spacious enclosure imitating the African savanna. But their adaptation is difficult. They are not afraid of people like wild lions, but they do not trust them either. They keep to themselves. They are creatures stuck between two worlds. At the end of the letter was a short, handwritten sentence. Ivan Petrovich, if you would like to see them, we would be happy to have you visit. Please let us know. Ivan put the letter on the table. He stared at it for several hours without moving. Should he go? Why? To see those who killed his best friend again? To reopen a wound that had only just begun to be covered by a thin layer of scar tissue? He got up, walked over to the wall where Kaiser's old collar still hung on a nail. He took it down and turned the cracked leather over in his hands. No, he wouldn't go. He couldn't. But that night, he had another dream. Not the nightmare where he saw Kaiser's death over and over again. He dreamed of 3 little blind kittens that trustingly huddled against his hand. And he knew he had to go. Not for them, for himself, to put an end to it. The journey took almost 2 days. An old bus, then a train. Ivan looked out the window at the passing landscapes, but he didn't see them. He was traveling into the past to bury it once and for all. The safari park amazed him with its size. The huge area, the cleanliness, the well-groomed animals. He was met by the same director, a gray-haired, calm man. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions, just shook Ivan's hand and said, "Let's go." They got into a small electric car and drove deep into the park. They stopped at a huge, almost invisible fence made of thick, bulletproof glass. Behind it stretched the savanna. Tall grass, sparse trees, an artificial pond. And there they lay on a large boulder, bathed in the midday sun. They were magnificent. Ryok had become a powerful, confident king. His mane had darkened and thickened. He lay there, lazily surveying his domain, and every movement exuded power. Next to him, a little further away, lay Scar. He remained second best, a shadow of his brother. He kept casting quick, obsequious glances at Reek. A little to the side, by the water, lay Zara. She had become a graceful, elegant lioness, perfection itself. Ivan looked at them, and there was no hatred in his heart, only a dull, numb pain. They were where they belonged, in their world, obeying their laws. The director remained silent, giving Ivan time. Ivan stood, not taking his eyes off the predators he had raised from a bottle. Suddenly, Zara raised her head. She sniffed the air as if she had caught something familiar. Her ears pricked up. She slowly turned her head and looked straight at Ivan. Their eyes met through the thick glass. For a second, just one tiny second, Ivan thought he saw recognition in her eyes. A flash of memory of a warm home, an old dog, hands that had fed her. But it was only a moment. She blinked, shook her head as if to dispel a vision, and calmly turned away, returning to contemplate her savanna. The connection was broken. For good. Ivan nodded to himself. That was it. Enough. He turned to the director. Thank you, he said quietly. I saw everything. They're safe. That's what matters. He didn't wait for a reply and headed back to the exit. He didn't look back. The return trip was different. He no longer stared into the void. He looked at the towns and villages, at the people, at life going on. When he got home, the first thing he did was open all the windows, letting the fresh autumn air into the stuffy house. The silence no longer weighed on him. It was just silence. In the evening, he got into his old car and drove to the district center. He stopped at a nondescript building with a sign that read, "Shelter for Homeless Animals." He went inside. The air was filled with barking and the smell of medicine. Dozens of dogs sat in cages, large and small, purebred and mongrels. They all looked at him with hope. He walked along the rows. He wasn't looking for a sheepdog. He wasn't looking for a replacement for Kaiser. It was impossible to replace him. In the last cage, in the far corner, huddled in a ball, sat a small, trembling puppy. Dirty, frightened, with ears of different sizes. He didn't even bark, just stared at Ivan with huge eyes full of universal sorrow. Ivan silently opened the cage and held out his hand. The puppy recoiled, but then, after hesitating, cautiously licked his finger. Ivan picked him up and held him close to his chest. "Let's go home," he whispered. When he opened the door to his house, he froze for a moment on the threshold. Then he stepped inside, carrying a new, small life in his arms. And in the deafening silence of the empty house, a quiet, uncertain bark sounded again. The story of Ivan and his unusual family is over. But the main question remains open for each of you. What do you think? Was it worth it for Ivan to save the lion cubs, knowing that it ultimately led to the death of his best friend, Kaiser?